from. This is your host, Michael Cross, here with another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Tonight, we have a very special guest. But first, I got to do my plug. Check out my website at michaelcross.net or follow me on Twitter at PsychoMike777. Okay, that's out of the way. Let's get started with the show. Tonight, we have zombies. And, no, not as guests because that would be pretty one-dimensional. No, we have Professor Brian Anse Patrick, who has written a book that sounds really fascinating. It's called Zombology, which I'm sure he's going to tell us all about. He's a professor at the University of Toledo, teaches undergraduate programs, group communications, propaganda, persuasion, and so forth. So, without further ado, Mr. Patrick, come on in. Tell us about is zombies just a fatty thing, or is there something deeper about this obsession we seem to have had for the last several years with zombies?
Oh, much deeper than a fad. The hula hoop was a fad. Zombies are something much deeper and darker and with a great deal of meaning. One of the major themes of my book is that the zombie phenomenon represents a disturbance in the Western collective unconscious concerning anxiety over Western decline. So the zombie represents it's a sort of an archetype. It's a very heavy kind of symbol, and it represents things like fear of inundation, fear of civil unrest, decline, fears of overpopulation, fears of resource diminishment. I've already said uncontrolled immigration, things like that. It's the fear that the people in the inner city are going to come and eat the people in the outer cities, and so forth. The zombie represents a lot.
Okay, well, let's get started with the most popular TV show on right now when it comes to zombies, and that's The Walking Dead. And I read an article recently in National Review where it was basically saying that there's a really deep meaning behind the show, that it's a study in philosophy put to like game theory, and each episode is really more of a study in psychology and sociology. Would you agree with that?
I would to some extent, yeah. I'm familiar with some game theory, and there are win-win and win-lose scenarios in game theory and so on. I suppose you could look at Walking Dead from that backdrop, and it certainly represents. I in my book, I quote Thomas Malthus, the man who predicted that, the big problem is going to be that population increases exponentially and our ability to feed population does not. So at some point you're going to have more people who are hungry than you're going to have resources. And I think that's part of the zombie phenomenon as well. That's one of the anxieties that the zombie phenomenon is talking to. Also, the National, I think, talked about Hobbes. I think of Hobbes as, everybody remembers Hobbes from that line, primitive life was short, brutish, and nasty. Well, I think that's probably most of the episodes of Walking Dead.
Yeah. Bringing up Hobbes, the other thing about Hobbes is he felt that, you have to have this really strong authority to keep things under control. And when The Walking Dead started, the main character, Rick Grimes, was sort of a democratic person. He didn't want to really boss people around. But as the show progresses, he becomes very Machiavellian, almost, I would say, psychopathic. But that seems to be what is needed to survive in this kind of scenario. So it seems it's very Hobbesian in a sense that you need to pull your people together. You need to have everyone under control, and then you're versing the world.
Yeah, it was, one of the old ancient worries, especially during medieval times, that civilization was merely going to, it's just going to fall apart. The Roman Catholic Church was the reason they controlled interpretation of the Gospels and religion and stamped out what they regarded as heresy, because they were afraid of fragmentation. And, of course, the world of The Walking Dead is extreme fragmentation. So Hobbes is writing from this kind of point of view as well. He believed that there was a social contract and you put people in power and damned well better obey them. The king was there for a reason. And he even regarded things as voluntary associations. I think it was Hobbes who said they were worms in the entrails of society. He couldn't abide the idea of competitive social orders that were competing with the hierarchical authoritarian regime.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Sounds like getting like the Freemasons and stuff like that.
Oh, no, he wouldn't have liked them at all. Definitely not.
So, what do you think would happen here? And then we can get into more of the, deeper sociological things. But I interviewed a Professor Tainter who wrote the book When Complex Societies Collapse. And he said that if the electrical grid, and he listed a bunch of different things that could destroy it, if the electrical grid collapsed in the United States, by conservative figures, about 200 million people would be dead before the year was over. And it's because, there's no infrastructure. And so therefore everyone who, there's going to be a competition for what's left. And there's going to be this kind of, again, Hobbesian sort of thing. Do you think that's the way people would be, or were they pulled together kind of like the Japanese did when the Fukushima thing took place, where there was no looting and everyone just kind of tried to pull together? But then again, it was a momentary disaster. Well, in the sense of the earthquake and stuff.
Well, the Japanese seem to have more of a hierarchical, authoritarian-based society. They respect authority and so on. That's my general impression. I'm a professor, so I see a lot of young people. I see a lot of people. And I can't but help make evaluations of various sorts, kind of estimations of their abilities. And I think this 200 million figure, I don't know exactly how the professor arrived at this, but it may not be unrealistic. I have noticed I'm above the median age in society now. I think I'm 61 years old or something like that. And I grew up and I knew how to do things like build a fire. I can pound a nail. I can change a headlight. I can do a lot of things. I mean, pretty complicated things. And I notice I talk with young people and they don't even know how to use a broom. Something simple like that. I mean, I watch people try to work and they have not even the most basic of skills. So yeah, I would think if you turned off the power, we'd probably be back to cannibalism in most of these cities. Once the supply of hostess ding-dongs ran out.
Zombie land.
Yeah, that's right. And believe me, I don't think the average person, the average household has very much food around at all.
No. That's one thing I would encourage people to do. That's one of my issues I do promote, is the idea that you should look at how much you would survive with if suddenly there was no way of getting to the store. And if it comes up to less than at least a month, I would say, preferably 3 or more, so you can at least get your feet on the ground, then you're seriously going to be hurting if something does collapse.
Mm-hmm. And I see students, they're in an odd position in their lives anyways, and they appear to survive mainly on pizza and energy drinks. But once, I tell you, if things were interrupted, there would be major problems. And think of it from another point of view. You have, in the United States, virtually all of the major cities are ghettos. Yeah, the whole center of the city is a ghetto. I don't care how you want to gloss that over and so on. And, these places are, by their nature, marginal as far as survival resources and so on goes. What happens if the mail isn't delivered for a week, or if the checks don't go out, or if there's nobody in the store to take the, they don't use checks now. They use what they call bridge cards and things like that, the credit cards with the welfare on it. What happens when that doesn't work?
Didn't food stamps, the little card that they use for food stamps, didn't that give out just for a short time a couple of years ago, and there was almost like riots at stores?
Oh, I don't know for a fact, but I'm sure it has in various places. I come from Detroit, which is in many ways an ugly town, and it's a decayed town. It might explain in part my fascination with declining Western society, or the idea that Western society is declining. And I can tell you stories. People would come and sit in front of abandoned houses where they got their welfare checks, because I think there's a lot of welfare fraud going on. So around welfare check day, the people would come in aluminum chairs and sit in front of the house until the mailman came. And if the mailman didn't deliver the welfare check, they wanted to fight with the mailman, like beat up the mailman. It was the mailman's fault. I mean, these are very, that's a lifeline, and it becomes an entitlement. It becomes, several generations of this, and you have tens of millions of such folks in the United States, at least in the major cities. What are they going to do? What is going to happen if these people are hungry? They have no power. They have no basic necessities. They're gonna come calling.
Mm-hmm. I wonder. Going back again to the Walking Dead thing, they kind of imply in the series that, although it's not really spelled out, maybe the new series spinoff kind of gets into it, but that you get the idea that the military tried to seal off the cities. I mean, that they were bombing the cities, and they weren't necessarily bombing zombies when they were doing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the subtexts, I wouldn't call it subtext, but I'll just say one of the texts of virtually the whole canon of zombie literature is it's always, I don't know about always, but it's almost always the government's fault or authority that's screwed up, or it's some kind of corporate fault. And it's this kind of large-scale bumbling that's responsible for the zombies in the first place. Some disease that got out, some testing of some organism or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one thing you often see in these zombie films is authority trying to contain the problem. And, of course, they screw it up even more. That's the nature of authority. So, yeah, the idea here is that authority is not your friend, and it tries to cover its own ass. And what are you going to do? I think you have to be Sheriff Grimes and maybe get a little small group together and hope you live.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking. Yeah, it was Resident Evil, where it was a corporation that messes things up. They never really tell you on The Walking Dead what caused it. There's a lot of shows, where it's something the government does or brings back from space or something like that.
I remember a line somewhere where they said somebody made this or somebody made this bug or something like that. Mm-hmm. But other than that, the implication is there, though, that somebody screwed up high up.
Yeah, nanotechnology maybe. That would be a good one to throw in. The other aspect I think is interesting about these films, and maybe it is an appeal, is it tends to force everyone into like survival mode, but it seems to get rid of distinctions that society had created. It destroys political correctness. There's no political correctness in a zombie film.
That's, I'm thinking about that. That's true. It's very much a leveling thing for the survivors. I mean, here we are where it's us and them, and suddenly, the us becomes a lot more, I guess you could use the term inclusive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because
if you survive, you're one of us, yeah.
Yeah, so you have situations where you throw people together that are very unlikely to ever have socialized, but then they have to rely on each other to survive.
Well, even the first, I don't know if it was the first zombie film, the first modern zombie, the old zombie films like from the 30s and all that kind of stuff, that was a different kind of zombie. That zombie was just a minion that was under the control of some evil sorcerer or something like that. But the modern zombie is kind of self-sufficient by modern standards, and kind of shuffles in its own direction and so on, and is basically, has a certain kind of limited autonomy, and it's not under anyone's control, really. But you see, in the first zombie film of this sort that I'm aware of, which is, of course, Night of the Living Dead, I think it was.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure, I'm thinking. You remember the characters? There was, I think it was Ben. He was a black man.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some other characters, one of which was the woman, the leading, I guess she was the leading woman. She was the sister of this guy, and they were both, well, anyways, she's been called Useless Barbara, which is very typical of modern people. And Ben, the black man, is the only sensible and useful and brave person in the whole damn film. He's the only person capable of an intelligent response, an organized response. He's the only person capable of giving orders. He has lots of trouble from his useless people he winds up in this house with. But it's an interesting kind of, especially the time it was made. Back, when was this, 1960 something?
I remember I was a kid when I saw it, so it was the late 60s, I think.
Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a very, even from a point of view of racial inclusion, race relations, it's a very interesting film. Very interesting film. I mean, it's almost, most of the white characters are weak beyond belief. They are so weak they can't survive.
Except except at the end where I don't going to give any spoilers away for people that have not seen it. I think it's probably out there on just social media now. But the rednecks that are out shooting zombies, they seem to have it together.
Kind of, but they're kind of a low level, but they are. And then Ben gets killed in the end. I don't think we're letting any plot go here, because if you haven't seen a film that was made 1960 something, it's about time you saw it. The director, I don't think he ever copyrighted that thing properly, so I don't think there's even a copyright on that film.
Might not be. The interesting thing, like you said, the difference of the zombie films is, like the 1960s, it was always like a Haitian thing, but it's sort of kind of, before that, it sort of had this kind of, the communists are coming. So there's this guy who's got this control over these people that aren't actually really dead. They're more like they're drugged or trance or something.
Yeah, that was kind of a fraud zombie. They were kind of retarded by drugs or whatever, pharmaceuticals. You can still find recipes for the alleged Haitian voodoo zombie mix.
Yeah, Jeffrey Dahmer tried to make zombies out of some of his victims. Unsuccessful.
That doesn't surprise me. Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. But the new zombie is a different thing. It's funny. I got this idea. I've been dwelling on this idea for a while before I wrote the book, and it kind of jumped into motion when I went to a mall with my wife. And so many of the malls are scenes in the zombie films. I mean, if you see some of them, they're kind of mockeries of consumerism. Mm-hmm. And that's what people do. They shuffle through the malls and they kind of gravitate towards displays and so on. And you see this in a lot of the zombie films. You're not like a general. We're going to be on a webcast or something. Am I correct?
Well, it'll be on YouTube.
Okay, so we can use blunt language here.
Okay.
I hope. Okay. Well, my wife's comment was, we were pulling into this mall, and she said, quote, "I hope all the fucking zombies at the mall took their fucking Prozac today."
Well, it feels like that. I mean, I've been hearing these cases where someone's on their iPhone or something and they get hit by a car because they just walk right out in the street, not noticing.
Sure.
Or walk off a building or something. I notice that in the zombie films, often they'll do something like if there's something glittery, they're attracted by it.
Yeah, glittery, noisy. Mm-hmm. It's consumerism, I tell you. That's one of the parallels. It's kind of like Descartes, except it's instead of cogito ergo sum, it's I shop, therefore I am, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be the summum bonum, or however. I can't say anything in Latin, but that's the idea. The apex of existence.
Yeah. Which we have gotten into that. I mean, I remember. I mean, you're 60 or so. You probably still remember when you were growing up that your parents, when people worked in those days, they worked so they could support a family. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's what you did. You worked so you could provide a home, car, something good for the family, and hopefully get them a college education so that maybe they didn't have to work in the steel factory. Or
that was the dream.
Yeah,
it certainly was.
But it seems that today people have an attitude, and I think it's consumerism, that they want all this stuff, and if it's not too inconvenient, they might settle down with someone and might have a kid or two in the process.
Yeah, providing it doesn't interfere with my role-playing games or my paintball games and so on. Yeah. People seems like adolescence has become prolonged, and I mean to the point where there are a lot of 40, 50-year-old adolescents. I work in a university environment, and I see a lot of professors who are this sort. They're kind of overgrown adolescents, except without the physical agility or the beauty or the charm.
Yeah, but we've done this, and it's part of consumerism. If you can keep people still occupied with the idea of, oh my gosh, I've got to look just right, a 35-year-old female professor who's really freaking out because she can't find the right makeup, before she gets up in front of class, that's like a 16-year-old.
Sure it is. Very much so. And they're about that level. It's the direction of the West. It's a sad thing.
But you don't think...
Go ahead, please.
Okay, I was going to say, the Greek philosophers, you can, because I've made comments about this on my website and stuff, and then someone will respond with a quote from Socrates about, well, the young people today just aren't, up to measure. But I usually throw out the idea that when what he was talking about was the 1%. Those were the people that were wealthy, they were elitist, and so their children were raised not too much different than our, kids nowadays. I mean, they didn't have all the electronic stuff, but they still had this kind of spoiled way of looking at life. But you still had 99% of the population that was still having to do the basic stuff, and so their kids were raised with a work ethic. Nowadays, we have television, children's networks. I'm not going to name anybody by name, but they're horrible. Everything is consumerism, and, it's not what you know. It's not going to school and learning. It's how you look when you go to school. I mean, it's really mad.
I've watched people try to do physical work, young people, and they don't know how to do. No, I don't think they don't know how to do simple things like use a shovel, use a broom. I mean, it's like they're 4-year-olds or who haven't developed coordination yet or something like that. Now, I don't think using a broom is again, one of these high experiences of your life, but it's something you should know how to do. You should be able to change your oil. You should be able to put a bandage on a finger. You should start a fire. You should be able to, replace a window. They're basic, simple things. You don't have to be a genius, and yet a lot of this stuff is beyond the reach of most of the population. I mean, they have to call someone to do it for them. It's alarming. But this notion of decline that you brought up, are this current generation. I mean, this is a very Western preoccupation, anyways. If you read Homer, and I like Homer, by the way, he talks about this modern, these modern men, these modern wimpy men. It takes like half a dozen of them to pick up a rock that one of the ancient heroes could pick up, stuff like that. So it's a common preoccupation. But on the other hand, I've seen it in my life. I mean, when I was a kid, and I know this sounds like I'm 60 years old, and when I was a kid, I was like Tarzan. I think bags of cement weighed 96 pounds. Now they weigh 50 pounds. So, there's something going on there. And again, there's a lot more intelligent ways to do things. But I think this decline with the West is part of the zombie thing too. People feel in their bones that we're all going to hell in that handbasket, that the things aren't what they should be. And I think it's the opposite side of the coin of Western progress. I mean, at the same time, we have this preoccupation with progress and technical progress and so on. So there's always this fear. But even Socrates, I remember reading Socratic dialogue, and it was obvious that the kid in the dialogue, this was the one on friendship, was Socrates was grilling him about something, and it was pretty obvious that this kid would get his ass beat by his aristocratic parents if he didn't behave. I mean, there are standards, definitely, whether he's well-to-do or not. But nowadays, I see, I watch a lot of people, and I see immigrants come to the country, and they actually are parents. They act like parents. They're responsible for their children, and their children are raised to the point where they actually have a mother and father who they account to and so on. And they go to a restaurant, and they're all well-behaved, and they're sensible, and they're talking like people should talk. And I see your typical American suburban family, and the kids are running around like little monkeys or something. I mean, there's no sense of boundaries. There's no sense of that they might get run over or something like that. These kids are totally out of control. And I wonder at that, too. I do wonder at that. One thing I really wonder about is that Bernie Sanders allegedly got 50% of the vote in this Iowa caucus. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you're probably familiar with Bernie Sanders.
Well,
he's
yeah.
The socialist candidate. And the reason I believe this is because he promises a lot of free stuff. And some of my students like Bernie Sanders, and I don't care who they vote for or anything. I mean, they do what they want. But I tell them, hey, Bernie Sanders is Pete Seeger without the banjo. And he's like talking things about free tuition and stuff like that. And this seems very attractive to them. They say, well, that's what they do in Europe. I said, yeah, but 95% of you couldn't get into college in Europe, into a university. I mean, along with this comes standards. And, but they think it's all supposed to be, come out of the air, like manna from heaven or something. It's interesting.
Well, I was listening. I was recently talking to an American diplomat, and he said one of the problems they have in the Middle East is rising expectation gap. And that was when they had a relatively small population, they had the oil, then you could train people to be bureaucrats and plug them in. They had their money, they had an income, they could support their family, and that was great. You kept the population kind of happy. But then the population grew. There were many of those countries when I was involved in Model UN when I was in high school, you know what the populations of some of these countries were, and they're like 6 and 7 times bigger now. But there's no place to put all the people. You can't make everyone a bureaucrat. And they haven't
been attempted to work in a university.
Yeah. And the thing is that I think in America, you do have something that's going to be creating a problem in that there is this expectation gap where Americans see, well, for instance, Europe, like you said, many countries allow for free tuition, but you have to get certain level of points in order to get into university. Mm-hmm. You've got to qualify. You've got to be accepted into a program. Whereas if you have the money or get a grant in America, you can major in sociology or something, wind up with a huge debt and no job, but you can major in it. And
trust fund babies. All the trust fund babies I knew up at U of M when I was working on my PhD there, they almost all had, they were trust fund babies and they majored in anthropology.
Mm-hmm. And now they're wondering why they can't get work.
Some of them went to work for their uncle's banks and stuff.
Okay, they sold out.
No, they just went back to the family.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But the thing is, I think we're going to see more of this expectation gap in the United States because a lot of people used to just take jobs in the industries when they just couldn't make university or whatever. They just get a job at the factory and make probably more money than the professors made, because they're unionized. But those jobs are gone now. They're
largely,
out.
Yeah.
And
largely. Where I teach at the University of Toledo, we're in the city of Toledo, which used to be a pretty industrial town. And I think much of the town is still waiting in expectation that these $30 and $40 an hour manufacturing jobs are somehow going to come back here. And I have the feeling they're going to still be waiting many years from now. And they're waiting for some sort of deus ex machina kind of political event that, everybody says, okay, you're all wealthy and going to college now. I mean, it's expectation gap is a good phrase.
So they're waiting for basically the same way that you have thousands of people working as in Hollywood, working as working in a coffee shop or a strip bar, because they're waiting for that job that they're going to get called that's going to make their career in the movies.
Yeah, exactly. And there's that stuff's just not coming back. And worse yet, over time, you lose the skill base. It's funny, I was talking to a kid who said, we were talking about my zombie book because I gave my students a couple chapters. And I said, well, what do you happen if there's let's say there's a world war or something like this, like in the old scale what in America, what would you do for all these machinists and so on that you had back in the Second World War that turned the United States into the so-called arsenal of democracy? And he said, well, I was a machinist. And I said, what kind of machinist were you? And he basically pushed a button on a machine and started it. That's what he did and took the stuff out of it when it came out. But this guy had no more sense of how to operate or set up any kind of machine tool than a 10-year-old. You've lost that entire population over a couple generations. Those people just aren't around anymore. So, again, if there's an interruption, might be a long interruption of civilization.
Okay, I'm going to get back to that in a moment, but I was going to ask a very important question here, and that is the idea that in all the zombie films you have this networking. We don't know the people around us. Unless you go to a church or synagogue or whatever, you really don't have a connection to other people in modern Western society.
Students don't like it. They don't like talking to people. They like getting online. They tell me this. Yeah, it's interesting. And I see them walking around campus, 18, 20-year-olds, 4, 5, 6 of them walking in a group, and they're all got both thumbs going on their messaging little cell phone thing. They're not talking to each other. It's the strangest thing. Yeah, there aren't real networks. They're virtual networks, which are easily broken and probably they don't resound with any kind of, they're not solid. Some of the political groups that succeed, like the National Rifle Association and American Gun Culture, they succeed because they have real group connections at the local level and so on national levels. So it's interesting when you see real groups that can succeed with real face-to-face groups in actual conversation, as opposed to this virtual group that people exist in nowadays.
Well, at some point though, there is going to be a collapse. I mean, that's economically, I think we're just kind of basically on borrowed time, essentially. I mean, I always ask the question if I'm talking economics to someone who's like, well, things aren't that bad and stuff. I say, okay, let's think of the Great Depression. Okay, that kind of era, and then let's look at how many people are on food stamps today. What if suddenly food stamps disappeared? You'd have riots. I mean,
you'd have cannibalism.
Yeah. So essentially, the soup lines were nothing compared to what we have if we consider a food stamp card is essentially a ticket to a food line. I mean, that's what it is.
And there was I believe, a kind of a sense of authority in those days, a sense of personal limits, a sense of humility. The older generations were different kinds of people. I don't think the people around now, urban people and so on, have any sense of limits or whatever. I mean, they do what they can, but they're not exactly bound by some code of ethics instilled into them. The educational systems are a farce. I mean, many of the students I run into should not be in universities. I mean, they have trouble reading. They claim, some of them, never to have read a book. And I tell you, I believe them.
Oh, yeah.
After you talk to them for a while. Yeah. So, yeah, you get this group they're not very well socialized in the sense of, like, being members or proponents of Western culture. So I think that the inner controls are largely lacking. And at some point, when authority's not there or when authority calls in sick, you're going to have problems.
This is a totally unrelated subject, but you just got me thinking here, because I'm thinking about what Zimbardo was saying recently about young men are not forming relationships because they're spending all the time gaming or on porn. And then I'm thinking that if you switch on some of these reality networks, there's a large number of females that actually like these shows that are about, like, I mean, how many shows are there on these reality networks of a guy married to like 3, 4, 5 women? I think there's a bunch of them, aren't there?
There's I walk by them and I see them.
Okay.
Shows, and I can't really. They're all very similar, so it's hard for me to tell them apart.
But they all seem to have a situation where you have a network of people working together, and regardless of the marriage structure. But the thing is, the guy's always a little bit more traditional than you don't see a guy that's like trying to play hipster or something. I mean, they'll have him like out cutting trees or doing something with his sons and that sort of thing, it seems. And I'm wondering if the appeal of those kinds of things, plus these other shows, like I remember on History Channel, used to actually have history shows, but now they seem to have a lot of these rednecks doing stuff with cars. Is this an appeal? Yeah?
Yeah, I'm thinking too. You got me going. I'm thinking of the typical reality show with all these women and arguing. Usually they're uncivil. They're mean. And they're fractious. And you're right. The male tends to be, remember Leave It to Beaver?
Yeah.
Well, remember, what's his name? Ward Cleaver?
I watched him as reruns when I was a kid, but I can't remember I know what the characters look like.
And he went somewhere and worked, but I was never really quite sure where. And he always came in with a little bit of male, for the male role, the archetype. But that's all he was kind of an empty dummy. I guess you're right. I think the males are empty dummies on these things. Kind of like, well, this is the male supposed to do. And, here he fills this role, and the real action is between the women here. I don't know.
But at the same time, there's those kinds of shows, but at the same time, the ones that are like the polygamous ones, or on History Channel where you have a lot of these guys that are like trapping alligators in Louisiana or things like that. It seems that there seems to be some sort of appeal that the general public have of watching the life of truckers, some guy that can hold a family of 6 women together,
I guess there is that adventure aspect and this triumph over what they regard as the elements or something might be. But, I watched this one, these people are in Alaska, and between the whole group, they don't have 20 IQ points to rub together. I mean, I don't know how they can even survive up there other than the fact that these shows are that fake. I mean, they have this little drama thing. It would be interesting to do a content analysis of these things and compare them and draw out the common themes, because I think there would be wisdom would come out of this. One would suddenly tie a lot of strings together and saying, what's going on? What are the underlying themes? What happens to these kind of things? What are the plot resolutions? What are the character types and so on? But there's something going on here, and it has to do with people are looking for simplified roles and things like that. I don't know what they're looking for. Some kind of drama. People want drama, They need some kind of explainable, exciting thing about their lives. Otherwise, it's just, I'm stealing a line here from Carl Jung. He talks about life being cold, gray, and unending. So these things do provide at least kind of a vicarious sense of drama, and they disambiguate the gray and so on.
Quite interesting there. I mean, if you think about it, I mean, I've actually heard people say that if there was a war, it would at least make things not boring anymore. Like World War III. Well, zombie film with radiation at the same time.
Yeah.
Hey, lastly, I want to deal with the idea of, it's always easy to, on radio shows and stuff to sit and talk about what's bad and all, it's all going to gloom and doom and everything like that. But do you see some hope that we could pull ourselves out of this, that Western civilization could survive, or at least pockets of Western civilization be able to maintain itself, and then in the future, they will give rise to whatever new nations come along?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see is something like some sort of hyper pluralism. We're going to have groups of exceptional people who have formed political units here and there, and function. High functioning groups of people who are kind of autonomous and so on. I think the future of the gigantic mass democracies is a future of zombies. But I think there'll be groups of people like that because, when it comes right down to it, I've said this before, Western culture is the only boat that floats, really. It's got leaks and squeaky oars and all this kind of stuff, but it's a damned good idea. It's the only thing like it. I know of no culture that's been so transcendent. And I'm talking about even coming down to individuals and individual rights and creativity and a way to get the individual a way to become creative within the group and so on, to allow people to bloom and blossom and grow. And I don't think there's any other thing like this on Earth. So yeah, it's gonna continue in some way or another. The zombies may control some of the big territories and stuff, but when it comes down to it, there's still going to be groups of people, good ones, because virtue matters.
So there'll be like maybe religious sects, philosophical groups, these kinds of things.
I think so. And it's funny, like we have like a stereotype in the culture that like religious people are like, what's the term, intolerant and so on. Actually, the most tolerant people I've ever met are religious people, because they just assume there's such a thing as free will, and you're going to have to work this stuff out, whoever you are. And those are, and the entire now American society. I don't understand European society as well, but American society was essentially a pluralism. I mean, it was a place where people could go and kind of build their own little life, their own society, and so on. And you have all these associations. If you look at the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it basically says something. You have freedom from religion, not necessarily of religion, but freedom from religion from an established church. You have the right of association, and you have the right to print and publish all your stuff. And that's so groups can form, talk, and promulgate. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what they did. America is such a cool and creative place because it has so many of these voluntary associations. You don't get this kind of creativity out of the mass zombie society where everybody's just shuffling in some kind of big social order.
Yeah, and without singling out any European countries, which I could do. I'm doing that. Anyway,
I would never.
Okay, we're we're kind of on at the end of time here. How can people get your book?
Oh, my books are all on Amazon. Yeah, and just Amazon.com, or you can get them from Arctos Media. My Arctos prints most of my books. And I've got other academic titles, and I'll have other titles soon. I write books. When I was a little kid, I used to throw rocks, and now I write books. Same principle.
Oh, that's excellent. I do too, but right now I'm limited to fiction. So,
fiction is stuff too. It's true. I still have my propaganda classes read 1984 and Brave New World, because those books were written a ways back, but they were prophetic.
Oh yeah, very much so, very much so. In fact, 1984 nowadays seems like, oh, that's actually a refreshing form of liberty compared to what we're seeing nowadays.
Huxley got it, I think, more on base, because his society in Brave New World is just a society that's controlled by essentially spilling off excess energy through sex and consumerism and drugs and stuff like that. Instead of using this stuff for creativity, they just spill it on the floor. It's kind of like a psychic version of onanism, if you're familiar with that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
First instance of birth control mentioned in the Bible.
Yes. Well, they used to cut people's heads off and stuff too, so that worked. Kind of a drastic way to do it.
Okay. Well, and I think you're going to be coming back in the future here and talk about your propaganda book.
I would love it.
Excellent. Well, we'll make arrangements for that very soon. Okay, well, Thank you very, very much, Professor Patrick, for sharing all this information.
Thank you, Michael. And listen, if anybody wants to talk to me, I'm a real person. You can email me, whatever. So, I'm around. So give me a call if you got something to say. Anybody.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll leave some links there. Okay, well, take care.
Thank you, Michael, and goodbye.
Bye now. Hello, and welcome back to the last part of our show here on Unlock the Door Radio on UCY TV Productions. This is your host, Michael Cross here, and what I would like to do is deal with the subject of the Iowa primaries that just took place. First of all, I think that this caucus system that was set up is just serious. I don't come from a caucus state. It's direct primaries. You just go in, you vote at a precinct, and the thing is, I showed that video clip that's supposed to allegedly show improprieties being conducted by Clinton people at a Democratic precinct when they were counting up the hands of the people who were for Bernie Sanders and for Hillary Clinton. I wasn't too sure about the conclusions that they were coming up with, that maybe Bernie was in some way, that he was maybe cheated. I didn't really see that, but I did see something that was something that looked like a high school student body election. In fact, a student body election at a high school is probably a little bit more advanced because, of course, you have ballots. But when you have something where just people show up at a precinct and they raise their hand, all you people that are for Bernie Sanders, raise your hand, and they count the people. And then they count the people that are for Hillary Clinton. The problem I have with that is that it just looks so amateuristic. And also, I would point out to people, especially, I showed this video to people that weren't Americans, and they were like, what in the world's going on there? And I explained, this is something where people just show up and sit there until the votes are counted. And, weather can make a difference. The fact that maybe you're working, that can make a huge difference if you're supposed to show up to one of these events. And, at least if you're working that day and you can't go in a regular primary state, you could just go in and fill out an absentee ballot and still vote. But this system of just like, okay, all you people that have shown up here to express your support for this candidate, raise your hand and so forth. That is seriously just, it just looks like you could do all kinds of little shenanigans and get away with it and cause an election to go one way or another. I just personally think that, if Iowa was taking place the same time a whole bunch of other states was taking place, fine, go ahead and do it. It's a quirky state when it comes to their elections, but it would be offset by other states. But having it as the first one, I think is a little, I just don't think it's a good idea. Even if they're going to keep this system. And, I don't think it's really necessarily that much different when it comes to the Republicans, but I would suggest that maybe if there's other caucus states coming up, I think Utah is a caucus state, although I'm not sure. But if you live in a state where there's caucuses, maybe people should organize, if you're like one of the Donald Trump or Ted Cruz people, then I would suggest maybe organize something to where someone's filming this at every precinct, that you have people out there at every precinct and using their cell phones to record it. Because then if you're recording it and there's things that are going kind of weird and they come out and say this candidate won with this many votes, then at least you could challenge it and show all the recordings and say that, well, this adds up to a different number than what we're getting here. At least it would lend some credibility to it. I mean, there's people worried about various electronic voting methods and stuff anyway, so it's a good idea to at least, take away the fears so people don't think that elections in the United States are as corrupt as maybe some of these countries where they have to send down people from the United Nations to watch the process. I'm surprised they don't actually suggest doing that here. Anyway, the other thing I would bring up is a warning to Republicans. A very, very major warning to Republicans. Jeb Bush's campaign could not be saved by any. I don't even think if Aleister Crowley came back from the grave, he could use his magic and or John Dees or anyone else that they could use their magic to get Jeb Bush the nomination. And then you've got Christie. He's going nowhere fast. And the thing is that this only leaves one establishment candidate, and that's Marco Rubio. I mean, he's the guy. He's kind of like a young version of George Bush, except he does have some charisma about him. And I think he's attractive to Republicans for a variety of reasons. He's Hispanic, he's young, he's a pretty good speaker. Although during one of the debates I did listen to, he seemed to be really good at evading questions, but he's not the only one that does that sort of thing. But I may be wrong, but there's a lot of pictures of him and what's his face, John McCain. And if Rubio's like a young version of John McCain or Jeb Bush or these kind of candidates, do we really want this kind of person? Do we really want someone that's just going to give us the same old thing? I think Americans are really tired of intervening in other countries. What's good's it done us? Is the Middle East, as Donald Trump said, is the Middle East better off today that we have toppled people like Gaddafi, tried to topple Assad, and, did topple Saddam? Is the Middle East better off? Under every single way that you could measure it, I would say no. I mean, you could say, yeah, they have elections and they have a parliamentary system in Iraq, but would Iraq even, where would Iraq be today if they weren't getting assistance from other countries in order to fight ISIS? I mean, for a while there, it was looking like ISIS was going to overrun everything. So, essentially, I don't think they're in better shape. Was Saddam, a really good leader? Was he a nice guy? I don't think he was a nice guy, but he kept things under control. Gaddafi, I think, was actually a better person in regards to respecting people's rights, but he also was pretty firm in keeping things under control. The same when it comes to Assad. But, United States foreign policy, go in, tear the place up, and then leave. Oh, well, of course, you leave some corporations there. It wouldn't be good neocon politics if you didn't open the doors for all the corporations to go in there. But, I really don't want Rubio. I don't want to sit home. Well, I guess I would vote for the other things, but I might actually, if it was Rubio and Hillary, it's just like, oh, wow, who to vote for? Bruce or Caitlin? Anyway, the thing is that right now the media is going to really play up this idea of differences and antagonisms between Cruz and Trump. And if they do that, they're going to wind up perhaps damaging both of them. And then it's going to be look here, here's this guy who's just going to come and save the day. No one noticed him, but look at him now. Yeah, Mr. Good Guy. Okay, and he's going to have support from establishment. And you're not, Trump, you're going to get, I think, major change. It's a more populist candidate. Okay? He's not someone that wants to really sit there and just basically let the United States that the American people, and I think this is a very important point. I don't think Trump wants to continue with what we've had the last 20 years, that we have Darwinism for those who don't have that much money. And by that, I mean the 99%. Okay? You might be living in the nice section of town, up on the hill and stuff like that. But when it comes down to macroeconomics, you don't really count that much. You're not one of these big players like George Soros or someone like that. So the thing is, we have had economic Darwinism for regular people, and we have had socialism for either the very poor, who at least can qualify for some benefits, or the very rich, who can evade taxes all over the place. And I don't care what, Bernie Sanders gets elected. Is he going to be able to change the entire system? No, he's not. And, I've seen some of his plans. It would cost middle class people a fortune in taxes if he was able to fulfill all of his promises. I think people are looking at him like the nice old man who's like challenging the system. But, think about it. You gotta look at what he stands for and looks. Remember, he's still the guy who, if you look at some of the stuff from, the early 1970s and that era, he's still the same guy. It's just he's gotten older and people start, projecting that grandfatherly type thing onto him. Big mistake, okay? I admire the fact he's bucking the establishment, but do I really want him to be the one who creates something that might be even worse? Okay, yeah, challenging something's one thing, but putting in something that might actually be worse is something totally different. Now, the other thing though is Trump would have to go in there and basically try to create something of nationalism, which has been given a really bad name by academia and the media. And you ever wonder why that is? Have you ever wondered why when someone says the word nationalism, you're like, oh, like that? Okay? It's not something that's associated with Hitler, although that's what the media and academia want to do. At the time of Hitler, every country that was fighting Hitler, you could say, was nationalistic. Okay? Pride in country, put our people first, the whole thing like American jobs, let's help Americans, that sort of thing. Not, this kind of globalization of, let's make it like a global competition. Come on. I've been to countries where people get very, very little money. There's no way the average American can compete with that. But you might think, well, that's good for the consumer. Is it really good for the consumer? Not everyone can work at a coffee shop. Okay? That's not going to give you a strong country. And right now, we're kind of living on kind of a socialist thing that's keeping a lot of our cities going, and that is pensions, Social Security. A lot of those people, they have incomes. They worked for steel mills. They worked for lumber mills. They worked in mines. And now they're collecting Social Security and pensions. And so they're able to continue buying stuff at the store, continuing to buy things, new TVs, stuff like that. When that generation and then the baby boom generation that's now kind of, they're, Hillary Clinton's age, when that generation starts dying off, the Generation X, people born after 1960, and then Generation Y and millennials, they don't have those big jobs as much as, the others. Yeah, there's people that have great jobs, but there's not a lot of that manufacturing that had, that anyone could make a good family living. And when they start retiring, well, that's not going to be as much money. A lot of these people are going to continue working. Or, you might see someone who was working at a good job and they're greeting you at a big box store when they're 80 years old. The thing is that that's not so great. And, Trump, I think, has a lot of those kinds of ideas too. Maybe not as strongly. Cruz. Maybe not as strongly as Trump does. But I think Cruz or Trump would both be really good for the United States. Although I have to say, Trump has a lot more support amongst minorities than Cruz does from what I've seen. And he might actually stand a better chance of getting elected. And you got to remember, the population of whites is a proportion of the population of the United States, which Republicans depend on to get elected, white middle class people. That's dying out. Didn't have enough babies. Okay? That's just the mere fact. Did not have enough kids. So, you gotta pick up votes. You gotta get into the black community and the Hispanic community. And I think Trump could actually do it. Rubio, I don't think so. I don't think he's going to get people that are going to be going, yay, Rubio, and getting out there and really fighting for him. I think he has less charisma and support than Mitt Romney. I think he'd have a much less chance of getting elected than Mitt Romney did. And so, better think about this. Let the Democrats tear each other apart. If you're a really hardcore Trump or you're hardcore Cruz, don't attack each other on Facebook and all these other social media. Present your guy as best as you can, the positive things about him. Go after the others. If you really want to feel negative, go after the others. There's still plenty of Republicans that you can beat up there in social media. But don't damage Cruz and Trump to the point that they may go into the convention and then you do wind up with some establishment Republican instead of either of them. Okay? Think about that for a few minutes. Anyway, just a few things to think about, and I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.
JJ Inc. from Against the Wall, and you're listening to UCY.TV.